Imagine waking up one morning and looking outside to find it raining. Then imagine that rain continuing, not just for a day, not just for a week, but for 3 months straight. 3 solid months where the sky stays this dark, oppressive grey and water just keeps pouring down, day after day after day. That's exactly what happened in England in the spring of 1315. Now, we're used to thinking about medieval history in terms of wars and kings and crusades, but sometimes the most devastating events in human history have nothing to do with armies or politics. Sometimes it's just the weather, and in 1315 the weather decided to absolutely devastate Northern Europe in a way that would kill, and I want you to really think about this number, millions of people over the next 3 years. In a village called Woolpit, about 15 miles from the market town of Bury St. Edmunds, there lived a woman named Agnes, 32 years old, a blacksmith's wife, mother of 2 young children, and on this particular spring day, she's standing in what used to be her kitchen garden, watching everything she'd carefully planted rot in standing water. Think about what that means for a moment. In the medieval world, your garden wasn't a hobby. It wasn't something you did because you enjoyed being outside. Your garden was literally the difference between eating and not eating. Those cabbages, that's your family's vitamin C for the winter. Those turnips, that's calories when everything else is gone. Those onions, that's flavour, sure, but it's also food preservation and nutrition. And Agnes is watching all of it dissolve into mud. The barley in the manor lord's fields, and understand, barley was crucial because you could make it into bread, you could make it into ale. It stored well, it was reliable. The barley is laying flat in the muck, rotting. This isn't just a bad harvest. This is the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Famine. 3 years of agricultural catastrophe that would reshape European society. Agnes had what you might call a lower middle-class medieval life, if such a thing existed. Her husband Thomas was a blacksmith, which was actually a pretty important position. You needed blacksmiths. Tools broke, horseshoes wore out, weapons needed repair. So they had a stone cottage, not just a wooden shack with an actual hearth. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't at the bottom either. But here's the thing about famine. It doesn't care about your social status nearly as much as you'd think. When there's no food, having a nice cottage doesn't fill your stomach. By late June, the village reeve, think of him as the estate manager, makes an announcement that every single person in that village had to have been dreading. He'd done the math on the grain stores. He'd calculated consumption rates, and his conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. At the rate they were going through their remaining food, the village would be completely out by Christmas. Let that sink in. It's June. You know your food will run out in December, and winter, real winter, doesn't even begin until after Christmas. The manor lord, showing exactly the kind of leadership you'd expect from medieval nobility, had already packed up his household and left for London. He took the best food with him, naturally, and he left behind approximately 200 villagers to figure out their own survival. 200 people facing a winter with no food and no leadership. Now, Agnes had a secret, and this is where the story gets really interesting. 20 years earlier, when she was just 12 years old, Agnes had lived in a different village, and in that village, her grandmother had taught her things, strange things, food preservation techniques that the old woman said came from before the conquest. That's before 1066, before the Normans invaded. We're talking about knowledge that could have been centuries old, maybe even older, and here's what makes this fascinating. These lessons happened in secret, hushed conversations by candlelight, gathering ingredients at night under the dark moon, the grandmother warning young Agnes, 12 years old, remember, never ever tell the priests about this. Never tell the nobles. Why? Because in medieval Europe, there was this constant tension between what we might call official knowledge and folk knowledge. The church had very specific ideas about what was acceptable and what might be, shall we say, uncomfortably close to witchcraft. And an old woman teaching preservation techniques that predated Christianity, that could get you into serious trouble. When the grandmother died suddenly, Agnes was left with fragmentary knowledge and a leather-bound book. A book written in Anglo-Saxon, which Agnes couldn't fully read. Think about that. She's got this potentially life-saving information, but it's locked in a language she doesn't completely understand. Using terms that were already archaic even then, she married Thomas. She moved to Woolpit, and for 5 years, she kept that book hidden. She used the normal preservation methods everyone used: salting, drying, smoking. The really complex stuff, the techniques her grandmother had called the multiplier methods, stayed locked away, too dangerous, too mysterious, too likely to get her burned at the stake. But now, it's October of 1315. The rain has been falling for 6 months. People are starting to die. Not from starvation yet, but from diseases that spread when people are weakened by hunger. Bodies of travellers are being found in ditches, people who'd been walking to the next town, hoping for help, and they just collapsed. The village priest, Father Edmund, is preaching these increasingly intense sermons about how the famine is God's punishment for sin. The village needs to repent. They need to do penance. Meanwhile, everyone knows that Father Edmund has grain stored in the church cellar. For emergencies, he says. The emergency is now, but that grain stays locked up. Families are slaughtering their breeding animals. Now, if you know anything about farming, you know this is the point of no return. You're eating the animals that would produce next year's livestock. You're guaranteeing that even when the rain stops, even when the fields dry out, you won't have animals to rebuild your herds. You're sacrificing the future to survive the present. And on one cold October night, Agnes's youngest child, a 4-year-old girl, wakes up screaming, not the normal crying of a child who had a bad dream, screaming from hunger pains so severe she can't stand up. Agnes's husband, Thomas, is lying in their bed, too weak to work his forge. Their son is hollow-eyed and thin, and their daughter is screaming from starvation. That's when Agnes makes her decision. She retrieves that leather-bound book from its hiding place, and by the light of a single candle, because candles were precious, you didn't waste them, she starts trying to decipher her grandmother's notes, trying to piece together fragmentary memories from 20 years ago, trying to figure out what her grandmother had called the multiplier, the method that could, supposedly, multiply food stores beyond natural limits. Now, I want to be clear about what Agnes is risking here. We're not just talking about a failed science experiment. We're talking about a medieval village in the grip of famine and religious fervour. The neighbouring village of Farnham had just driven out an old widow for collecting suspicious herbs. The woman died of exposure before reaching the next settlement. Witchcraft accusations in medieval England weren't abstract legal theory. They were terrifying, brutal, and often deadly. Investigation by church authorities. Possible torture, confiscation of all your property, and if found guilty, burning alive. But Agnes looks at her screaming daughter. She looks at her dying husband. She looks at their dwindling food stores. And she decides that doing nothing is more dangerous than doing something. She's going to attempt the impossible preservation method, even if it means the village calls her a witch, even if it means she burns for it. Because sometimes in history, the most extraordinary acts of courage don't happen on battlefields. They happen in dark cottages in desperate villages, where mothers make choices between watching their children die or risking everything on ancient, half-understood knowledge that might save them. And Agnes of Woolpit is about to discover whether her grandmother's secrets can actually work, whether food can truly be multiplied, whether one woman's impossible cooking trick can feed an entire village through the longest, darkest winter of their lives. So Agnes has made her decision. She's going to attempt her grandmother's multiplier technique, and she has maybe 6 weeks before her family's food runs completely out. 6 weeks to figure out something she barely understands, using fragmentary notes written in a language she can't fully read, in a village where failure could mean not just starvation but accusations of witchcraft. No pressure, right? The work begins in absolute secrecy. Agnes waits until Thomas and the children are asleep, then lights a single candle and starts experimenting. Now, let me describe what she's working with here, because this is actually fascinating from a historical perspective. Her grandmother's technique involved creating these special preservation vessels using clay pots. You'd layer vegetables, fish and grain inside them in very specific patterns. Then you'd seal them with wax. But the crucial element, the thing that made this the multiplier, was a special brine solution, not just salt water, a mixture containing salt, vinegar, specific herbs, and something her grandmother's notes called the living starter, Agnes's, gradually realizing that this living starter is some kind of fermented substance itself. Though of course she doesn't have words like bacteria or culture. Medieval people didn't understand microbiology. They just knew that certain processes created changes in food. Milk became cheese, grain became beer, and somehow, with the right conditions, cabbage could become something else entirely. The problem is that Agnes doesn't have a living starter from a previous successful batch. Her grandmother died 20 years ago. Whatever starter culture the old woman had maintained is long gone, which means Agnes has to create one from scratch, and she has no idea how. The notes mention using wild plants gathered from specific locations, margins of fields, near running water, places where the old growth still thrived. So, Agnes starts gathering samples, flowering herbs from the hedgerows, leaves from ancient oak trees, bark from willows near the stream. She's operating on fragmentary memory and educated guesses, mixing these ingredients with salt, honey and water, then waiting to see what happens. Most of her attempts fail, spectacularly. Food spoils and has to be thrown out. And remember, this is during a famine. Every turnip she wastes on a failed experiment is a turnip her family could have eaten. Every handful of salt used in a bad batch is precious salt they can't replace. The psychological pressure of wasting food while your children are starving is something I can't even imagine. One night, one of her test batches ferments so violently that the sealed clay pot literally explodes, just bursts open in the darkness, spraying foul-smelling liquid across the cottage. Agnes is terrified the noise will wake the children, that neighbours will smell the strange odours coming from her home, that someone will start asking questions. Because in a medieval village, privacy basically doesn't exist. Everyone knows everyone's business. Houses are close together. Walls are thin. Unusual smells, unusual activities, unusual anything draws immediate attention and suspicion. And that's exactly what happens. In the third week of her experiments, Thomas wakes up in the middle of the night and discovers what she's doing, and the argument that follows nearly destroys their marriage. Now, put yourself in Thomas's position for a moment. You're a blacksmith. You're weak from hunger, but you're still the head of your household in a society where that actually means something. And you discover your wife has been conducting secret experiments with strange herbs and mysterious fermentation processes. In the middle of a famine, when the village priest is preaching daily about witchcraft and demonic influences, Thomas isn't being unreasonable when he's terrified. Just 2 months earlier, in the neighbouring village of Fornham, an old widow named Margaret had been driven out for collecting suspicious herbs. The villagers formed a mob, took everything she owned, and forced her out in the cold. Margaret died of exposure before reaching the next settlement. That's the context Thomas is operating in. Witchcraft accusations aren't theoretical. They're real, they're brutal, and they can happen to anyone. He begs Agnes to stop, to accept their fate, to trust in God's mercy rather than dangerous experiments. And Agnes and I love this moment because it shows just how clear-headed she is. Agnes doesn't argue about faith or mystery. She shows him their daughter's hollow cheeks, their son's protruding ribs. She opens their food stores and makes him count what's left. Then she lays out the mathematics. Conservative strategies, careful rationing, foraging for nuts and roots, hoping for charity from the Lord or the Church. Those strategies only delay starvation. They don't prevent it. The math doesn't work. There isn't enough food to last through winter using conventional approaches. Her experiments offer something different, a genuine possibility, however remote, of a breakthrough that could save not just their family but the entire village. It's a risk calculation, and Agnes has decided that the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of trying something desperate. Thomas, to his credit, eventually agrees. He'll stand with her, whatever comes, though you can bet he's still terrified. And then, in early November, something happens. Agnes opens a test pot she'd sealed 3 weeks earlier. She's expecting another failure. She's almost gotten used to the disappointment. But when she breaks the seal, she finds the contents not only preserved but actually increased in volume. The cabbage she'd placed inside has transformed into something tangy and pungent, and the clay pot is now nearly full, even though she'd only filled it halfway initially. The multiplier has worked. Now, what's actually happening here, and Agnes has no way of knowing this, is a process called lactic acid fermentation. Bacteria naturally present on the vegetables and in her wild-gathered ingredients are converting sugars into lactic acid. This creates an acidic environment that preserves the food, while simultaneously producing gas that expands the food mass. The fermentation also increases the nutritional value, creating probiotics that help starving bodies absorb nutrients more efficiently. But Agnes doesn't know about bacteria or lactic acid or probiotics. She just knows that food went into the pot was sealed, time passed, and now there's more food than she started with, and it's good food, preserved food, food that will last through winter. She weeps. Then she immediately starts experimenting with larger batches. Over the next 2 weeks, Agnes discovers the process works with many vegetables, but is especially effective with cabbages, turnips, and fish. She learns the right proportions by trial and error. She figures out timing. She develops an intuitive understanding of when fermentation is proceeding correctly, versus when a batch is spoiling. She's essentially conducting applied microbiology without any scientific framework, just observation, experimentation, and desperate necessity driving innovation. But now Agnes faces a different kind of problem, a moral problem. She has knowledge that could save lives, hundreds of lives, maybe thousands if the technique spreads to other villages, but revealing it means exposing herself to accusation. The very same transformation that could save people could also get her killed as a witch. For 3 days, Agnes prays. She thinks. She wrestles with conscience and fear and duty. The decision comes when she's walking through the village one morning and finds a small body lying in the lane. 5-year-old Peter, the carpenter's son. The boy had been playing, grew weak, collapsed, and never got up. Dead from starvation at 5 years old. Agnes attends the funeral mass. She watches Father Edmund intone prayers for Peter's soul while offering no practical help for the living. She watches the carpenter and his wife bury their child in the frozen ground. And that afternoon, she tells Thomas she's going to demonstrate her preservation method publicly, before the entire village, in the church, whether he supports her or not. After a long silence, Thomas nods. He'll stand with her, whatever comes. Agnes sends word to Father Edmund, requesting permission to show the village a food preservation technique that might help them survive. The priest is suspicious. He questions her extensively. What exactly is this technique? Where did she learn it? Why has she kept it secret? Agnes is careful in her answers. She emphasizes that this is old knowledge, passed down from her grandmother. She frames it as rediscovering traditional methods, not inventing something new. She promises complete transparency. She'll demonstrate everything in public, in the church, where everyone can see that there's nothing demonic or unnatural about the process. Father Edmund reluctantly agrees, partly because he's genuinely concerned about his flock, partly because if he refuses and people keep dying, his moral authority will be destroyed, and partly because he's curious. If this peasant woman actually has a way to preserve food, the church should know about it. The demonstration is scheduled for the first Sunday in December, and Agnes has 2 weeks to prepare for the most important performance of her life, a performance where success means salvation for her village, and failure might mean burning at the stake. No pressure at all. First Sunday of December, 1315, St. Mary's Church in Woolpit, and 200 desperate, skeptical, frightened people are crowding into the cold stone building to watch a blacksmith's wife either save them or condemn herself. Think about the atmosphere in that church. Children are sitting on the floor, too weak to stand for long. Women line the walls, many of them having just buried their own children. Men stand in the back with their arms crossed, faces hard, waiting to see if this is real help or dangerous nonsense. And Father Edmund is positioned near the altar, ready to intervene if Agnes shows any sign of heresy or witchcraft. Agnes's hands are trembling as she sets out her materials on a wooden table in full view of everyone. Clay pots of various sizes, salt, vinegar, herbs, cabbage and turnips, dried fish, and 2 sealed vessels that contain her fermented starter culture, the living essence that makes the whole process work. She's dressed in her finest wool dress. Her head is covered modestly, and before she does anything else, she bows to the priest and asks permission to offer a prayer. This is calculated. This is strategic. Agnes understands that everything depends on framing this correctly. She needs to position her work within Christian acceptability from the very first moment. So she begins by explaining that this is ancient knowledge, perhaps even biblical. Wisdom, she suggests. Didn't the Israelites preserve food during their 40 years wandering the desert? Didn't God provide manna that multiplied to feed the multitudes? She's merely rediscovering old methods of stewardship, using God's natural gifts to extend the harvest. Every word is carefully chosen. She's emphasizing divine providence rather than human manipulation. She's connecting her technique to biblical precedents. She's positioning herself not as an inventor or a witch, but as someone recovering lost wisdom. And then she demonstrates the process, step by step, moving slowly enough that everyone can observe clearly. She layers cabbage leaves and chunks of turnip in a large clay pot, sprinkling each layer with coarse salt that everyone recognizes, nothing mysterious about it. She adds vinegar mixed with water. Again, ordinary ingredients. She includes herbs, dill, caraway, mustard seeds that people use in everyday cooking. Nothing exotic, nothing suspicious. Then comes the crucial moment. She adds liquid from one of her sealed starter vessels. And here's where Agnes's genius really shows. She could have mystified this part. She could have made it seem magical. Instead, she explains it in the simplest possible terms. This liquid, she says, contains the living essence that begins the preservation. She doesn't claim it's magic. She doesn't claim special powers. She describes it as a natural process that has to be initiated, but then continues on its own through God's design. It's brilliant framing. She's acknowledging that something transformative happens without claiming to control it herself. Father Edmund interrupts. His voice cuts through the church. He demands that Agnes swear on the Bible that she uses no demonic aid, speaks no incantations, calls upon no spirits. And Agnes, without hesitation, without defensiveness, places her hand on the gospel book. She swears before God and all the saints that her work involves only natural ingredients and divine blessing. The priest scrutinizes her intensely. He's looking for any hint of deception, any sign of ungodly practice, but he finds nothing. The demonstration is too transparent, too ordinary in its mechanics, too focused on familiar ingredients. There's no grounds for accusation. As Agnes seals the vessels with wax and begins preparing a second batch, something remarkable happens. Something she hadn't planned on. Other women begin to help. First, Thomas steps forward to support his wife openly, then the blacksmith's apprentice, then the carpenter's widow, the woman who just buried young Peter, then families who remember Agnes's kindness when their own children were ill. A coalition of witnesses forms around her, and this changes the political calculation completely. It becomes dangerous for Father Edmund to condemn Agnes without clear evidence, because now he's not just condemning one woman, he's condemning everyone who's helping her, everyone who's vouching for her character. Agnes prepares 6 large preservation vessels during that demonstration. 6 vessels that will feed dozens of people if the technique works. She's showing the process at scale, proving it's not just a parlor trick, but a genuine food preservation method. And then she does something that shows remarkable wisdom. She acknowledges uncertainty. She doesn't promise miracles. She doesn't guarantee success. She simply says the vessels must be kept in cool places, cellars, outbuildings, and left sealed for at least 2 weeks while the transformation occurs. She invites the village to wait and see together. She's sharing both the knowledge and the risk. Those 2 weeks test everyone's faith, not just in Agnes's technique, but in each other, in God, in the possibility of surviving this catastrophe. Agnes returns home each night, wondering if she's miscalculated, if the public batches will fail while her private experiment succeeded, if she's condemned herself for nothing. The village fractures into factions. Those who believe Agnes offers real hope. those who suspect witchcraft, those who think the whole demonstration was desperate fantasy. Father Edmund preaches caution. Some families begin their own preservation attempts despite limited ingredients. Others hoard what little they have, convinced fermentation is foolishness. The village is holding its breath, waiting. And then comes the winter solstice, December 21st. The shortest day of the year, the day when ancient peoples celebrated the turning point, when the sun would begin its return, the day the village gathers again to witness the opening of the vessels. Agnes breaks the wax seal on the first large pot, her hands steady now. Prayers on her lips. The smell that emerges is sharp, tangy, powerful, but not rotten. She lifts out handfuls of fermented cabbage and turnips, and everyone can see the pot is now 3/4 full, where it had been barely half full when sealed 2 weeks ago. The food has multiplied. A murmur runs through the crowd. Is this real? How is this possible? Father Edmund steps forward to examine the fermented vegetables. He tastes them. They're perfectly preserved. Actually improved, more flavorful, more tender than fresh vegetables. And the priest, recognizing the moment for what it is, declares it a miracle worked through faithful hands. Now, Edmund probably has private doubts. He's educated enough to know there's some natural process at work here. But he also recognizes the political reality. Agnes has succeeded. The village is watching. And condemning her now would mean condemning hope itself. It would mean condemning a potential solution to mass starvation. So he blesses the fermented food. He declares it a sign of God's mercy on their suffering community. And the transformation begins. Over the next weeks, Agnes spends every waking hour teaching. Household after household learns to prepare preservation vessels. Women work together, sharing scarce ingredients, helping each other understand the timing and proportions. Every scrap of remaining food goes into clay pots, layered with the precious fermented starter culture that Agnes distributes freely. Children help gather herbs, men build additional storage spaces. The village becomes a cooperative preservation factory. And here's what's remarkable. It works. The technique proves remarkably consistent. Cabbages, turnips, onions, fish, all transform successfully. By late January of 1316, virtually every household in Woolpit has multiple vessels of fermenting food. The village will be hungry that winter. Make no mistake, they're not living comfortably, but they're not dying either. No one starves. No more children collapse in the lanes. Agnes's impossible trick has saved them. But the story doesn't end there, because success creates its own complications. Word spreads, and not everyone is happy about a peasant woman solving a problem that their betters couldn't solve. The manor lord is going to have some thoughts about this. The neighbouring nobles are going to want a piece of this action, and Agnes is about to discover that sometimes saving people's lives creates powerful enemies, because knowledge is power. And in medieval society, commoners aren't supposed to have that kind of power. News of Woolpit's survival spreads through the frozen countryside like wildfire, and desperate people start arriving at the village. Travellers from neighbouring communities, people who've heard rumours of a miraculous preservation technique, people who are watching their own families starve and are willing to try anything. Agnes welcomes them all, every single one. She teaches anyone who asks. She refuses to restrict her knowledge. She refuses to charge fees. She refuses to turn anyone away. And within 3 months, communities within 20 miles of Woolpit are practicing fermentation. Preservation. Within 6 months, the technique has reached Ipswich on the coast, Norwich to the north, and Cambridge to the west. Think about that spread. This is 1316. There's no printing press, no internet, obviously, no mass communication of any kind. This knowledge is spreading purely through human networks. Travelling merchants who visit Woolpit and see the technique, circuit preachers who carry news between parishes, women visiting relatives in other villages, labourers seeking work who pass through and learn the method. Agnes becomes a regional figure. Though she herself never leaves Woolpit, she doesn't need to. People come to her. They make pilgrimages to consult her. She trains deputy instructors. other women who grasp the technique quickly and can teach it in their own communities. The method evolves and adapts as different regions apply it to their local ingredients and conditions. It's a beautiful example of organic knowledge distribution, bottom-up, community-driven, exactly the kind of thing that scares authorities. Because by the summer of 1316, as the rains finally cease and the great famine begins its slow retreat, powerful people are starting to notice Agnes. And they're not all happy about what she represents. The manor lord returns from London to find his village of Woolpit functioning. Not just surviving, but functioning. And it's functioning under the guidance of a blacksmith's wife rather than his appointed officials. This is not how the feudal system is supposed to work. He demands, and I want you to hear that word, demands exclusive rights to teach Agnes's preservation technique. He threatens legal action if she continues distributing knowledge freely. He wants to control this, to monetize it, to charge fees for preservation instruction. And he's not alone. Several minor nobles from surrounding estates send similar demands. They see economic opportunity. They want to license the technique, to charge villagers for access to the knowledge, to turn Agnes's freely shared wisdom into a revenue stream. Now, put yourself in Agnes's position. You're a peasant woman. You have no legal standing. You own no property in your own name. Everything belongs to your husband. Challenging noble authority is, quite literally, unthinkable in medieval society. Commoners do not say no to lords. Agnes says no. She declares publicly that survival knowledge belongs to everyone, especially the poor. She refuses every demand for exclusivity. She continues teaching freely. This defiance is extraordinary. This is a peasant woman, in 1316, publicly rejecting the authority of multiple nobles. This should be impossible. But Agnes has leverage those nobles lack. She's saved hundreds of lives. She's earned fierce loyalty from common people across the region. And crucially, she has protection from the church. Father Edmund, whatever his private feelings about Agnes, recognizes that her miracle has strengthened faith and filled his church with grateful parishioners. He's not going to permit nobles to persecute the woman who demonstrated God's mercy so visibly. The tension between Agnes's democratic knowledge-sharing and authorities' attempts at control shapes the rest of her life. She continues teaching freely while deflecting noble pressure through strategic deference. She never claims personal glory. She always credits divine providence. She maintains close ties with local clergy. She carefully avoids direct confrontation with the powerful. She becomes skilled at appearing humble, while steadily undermining every effort to restrict access to fermentation techniques. It's a kind of passive resistance. She smiles, she bows, she uses all the right phrases of respect, and then she does exactly what she intended to do all along. Her children grow up immersed in this world of preservation and quiet resistance. Her daughter Margaret becomes an expert instructor, teaching fermentation throughout Suffolk. Her son John follows his father into blacksmithing but designs improved clay vessels and sealing methods. The techniques become embedded in household practice across the region, transmitted from mothers to daughters, grandmothers to granddaughters. And remember that leather-bound Anglo-Saxon recipe book, The Mysterious Inheritance from Agnes's Grandmother? That book becomes crucial to long-term knowledge preservation. Agnes works with a scholarly monk from the abbey at Bury St. Edmunds. Together, they translate and expand her grandmother's cryptic notes into a comprehensive preservation manual. Monks copy the text. They add illustrations and commentary. Multiple versions circulate through monastic libraries across England. This is brilliant strategy, because now the knowledge isn't just in Agnes's head or in oral tradition. It's in books. Books that can survive fires, raids, plagues, famines. Books that can preserve this wisdom for centuries. The original book, that precious inheritance from her grandmother, disappears after Agnes's death. No one knows what happened to it, but the copies survive, and those copies ensure that Agnes's work outlasts her life. Agnes lives to see the Great Famine end in 1317. She witnesses the gradual return of normal harvests. She sees her preservation methods become standard practice throughout East Anglia. Not exotic, not mysterious, just normal household knowledge that every competent woman is expected to possess. She dies in 1340, age 57, having survived the famine by 25 years, and her funeral draws both nobles and peasants. Think about that. In medieval society, social classes didn't mix. The great hall of a manor house had a literal physical barrier separating nobles from commoners. Funerals were class-specific events, but Agnes's funeral brings together people from every level of society. It's a testament to her unusual status, to the lives she saved, to the knowledge she shared. She's buried in St. Mary's Churchyard in Woolpit, the same church where she demonstrated her preservation technique 24 years earlier, and her grave becomes a site of quiet pilgrimage. Women learning preservation arts come to pay their respects, to ask for her blessing, informally. She's never officially canonized, but in the popular memory of the region, Agnes is practically a saint. The centuries that follow incorporate Agnes's techniques into mainstream European food culture. What medieval people understood as divine miracle, later generations recognize as applied microbiology. The lactic acid fermentation that Agnes mastered through trial and error becomes scientifically understood, systematically improved, globally distributed. Sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, preserved fish. All of these descend from fermentation traditions that Agnes helped preserve and spread during those desperate famine years. She's not the inventor, these techniques are ancient, but she's a crucial link in the chain of transmission, a moment where old knowledge, on the verge of being lost, was recovered and shared widely enough to survive. And then, in 1998, more than 650 years after Agnes's death, archaeologists excavating medieval Woolpit uncover something extraordinary. They find the remains of Agnes's cottage, and among the artifacts, buried in what had been her garden, they discover multiple clay preservation vessels, the actual pots she used. Chemical analysis reveals traces of lactic acid bacteria, the same strains used in modern fermentation. The physical evidence confirms what had seemed like legend. Agnes of Woolpit had indeed saved her village using fermentation techniques that modern food scientists recognize as sophisticated and effective. She wasn't working magic. She wasn't performing miracles in the supernatural sense. She was doing microbiology without knowing what microbiology he was. She was conducting applied science without the scientific method. She was solving problems through observation, experimentation, and desperate necessity. And her deepest legacy extends beyond the preservation techniques themselves, because Agnes demonstrated something that medieval society desperately needed to learn, that survival knowledge should belong to communities, not authorities. That ordinary people, especially women, possessed wisdom as valuable as any lord's education. That courage and generosity could reshape social structures even within rigid hierarchies. These principles, transmitted through generations of household practice and communal memory, influenced how medieval communities understood knowledge, authority, and mutual obligation. Agnes didn't write political philosophy. She probably couldn't write at all. But through her actions, she made an argument about how society should work, about who gets to control life-saving information, about whether knowledge should be hoarded or shared. Those clay vessels rest now in a museum, silent witnesses to one woman's refusal to let her village starve, to her determination to share rather than hoard, to her conviction that ancient wisdom and desperate innovation could save lives. Agnes of Woolpit transformed impossibility into nourishment. She took her grandmother's fragmentary secrets, her own courage, and the desperate need of a starving village, and she created something that would echo through centuries. She fed more than her village's hunger. She fed hope. She fed resistance to injustice. She fed the idea that ordinary people could solve extraordinary problems. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of history, that's exactly the kind of nourishment the world needs most.